We have a shade over 35 minutes for questions and discussion. I'd like to ask you to keep your comments and questions brief, to the point, to identify who you are and what your organizational affiliation is. I want to take a first round of 4 or 5 questions. It would be helpful, perhaps, Lord Ashdown has to leave at 11:20 for urgent business up the road, to perhaps, for the first questions, if we could focus a little on the overarching issues that he raised, intervention and so on, and then perhaps after that we can move on to the more Libya-specific issues that will doubtless arise. So please, fire away, and let's get discussion going. Yeah, any takers? Gentleman here.
Yes, James Bowman from the UNHCR. Yes, my name is James Bourne from the UNHCR. Yes, I was wondering, you were talking about interventions in the future, and I was wondering what you thought would be the main forum for which they would be organised in the future. Will it be through new regional alliances similar to NATO? Will it be through ad hoc assemblies of nations? Or will it be through the UN, and particularly the UN Security Council? And the reason I ask is because it seems that at the minute, and especially towards the future, the UN Security Council will seem very out of date. It won't contain nations that will be very important to the future. Will it adapt? Will it change to meet this growing multipolar world? And just sort of your opinions on that.
Thank you. And another, next question, please, if possible, on a related or tangentially related theme. Marta here, please.
Thank you. Thank you all. I thought a very phenomenally interesting panel. Paddy, I am convinced by your Aquinas 6 rules, and I am not offended by the last. I can see that before one goes to war, makes a careful judgment about whether it has got any chance to win. But I wonder whether that 6th principle can start to address the question of you put at the end, i.e. that there is any chance that you can do something following the intervention, which I think is a bit of an open question in Libya. So intervene to then be able to also do, and what that something will look like, which is I think is a little bit the hanging question, perhaps about Libya, but potentially in a number of other contexts. Marta Foresi, Politics and Governance at ODI.
One more in the same area? Okay, then.
Robert Bailey. Can you hear me? Robert Bailey, I'm a chief analyst at a commercial firm. I'm just wondering if, in connection with the globalization that you mentioned, Paddy, you might just say a little bit more about the rise of the illicit economy and the implication that has, almost swamping, in fact, some of the licit activities. I'm reading a book by Misha Glenny at the moment on McMafia, and it's quite sort of overwhelming, really. Okay.
Oh boy! You want to take those?
Yeah. Forgive me, guys. I may be slightly longer in the answer than you would feel comfortable with him, but I'm leaving at 20 past, and it goes on afterwards. This is really important. Can I just make some points? But I think they refer back to what you said, and particularly Marta's question, made by my colleagues here. First of all, humility of expectations when you intervene is absolutely crucial. Time and again, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have had preposterous ambitions about what we can do. My own view is that even saying that things will be better after we've intervened than they were at the time is beyond our reach. I probably think that the best we can say about intervening internationally is something much more limited than even that. I think the best we can say is things will be better than they would have been if we had not intervened. That's probably the furthest reach of our actual ability to deliver. And it's really important when we intervene that we underplay our ambitions rather than overplay them. To underplay and to over-deliver is acceptable. To overestimate and under-deliver is very damaging, both in the world opinion and in the opinion of the country in which you're intervening. I think you look at Libya, and for a long time, very possibly a decade, I shall return to that, I think the best we'll be able to say in Libya is that it will turn out it is better than it would have been if we hadn't have done it. It's better than the bloodbath of Benghazi, the bloodbath of Sarajevo. The second thing I really want to make, and this is crucially important, strategic patience is absolutely crucial. These things are not measured in weeks, they're not measured in months, they're measured in decades. It takes a long time to unstitch the chaos and enmities of conflict. I mean, you can play, when I walked into Belfast as a young soldier in 1969, someone said to me, it's take 37 years and we still wouldn't be there. I'm not sure I'd have gone ahead, but it has. The Bosnian intervention, which has arguably been one of the world's most successful up until at least 2006, has taken 15 or 20 years and we're not there. We're not there in Cyprus after 25 and 30 years. We're not there, in northern, it takes a long time. So, you can't get the education system right. I agree with you. It's very difficult that you can't. But hang on a second. There aren't integrated schools in Belfast. And in Bosnia, after 20 years after the intervention, 15 years after the intervention, the Croats and the Bosnians and the Serbs are all having separate curricula, separate schools. It takes a lot. By the way, note this fact. Education, you think it's easy. It's actually the most political issue of all, because it's through the education system that those who fought the conflict passed their values on to their children. And by the way, in my view, the way that you actually will begin to create a sustainable peace in these countries is when the generation that ran the war are moved to one side and the new generation takes over. And that does take 10 years. If you're not thinking in decades, you're thinking too short. And look, guys, let's just remember that some of their problems are not just their problems. So we said there are some real issues how to resolve the constitution. And there are some real issues how we divide up the resources. Yes, there are, between London and Edinburgh, not just between Tripoli and Benghazi. And there is a state of fragmentation. Yes, there is, in Belgium, as well as in Libya. These problems are not just their problems. We find it difficult to deal with. And it is simply ludicrous to suggest that they can jump from conflict to Westminster in 5 weeks. And if you do, then you are setting yourself up for failure. I want to quickly just mention two other things. The internet, what's its role? If you think you can go in there and do it for them, you can't. They won't let you to start with, and the Libyans are quite right in being very clear about that. But if you do, I promise you'll screw it up more than they will. You don't have to go to, just take a look at what happened in Iraq and take a look at what happened in Afghanistan. It may be untidy, but the best you can do, as you rightly said, is to enable them. The quick question of R2P, very quickly, my guess is that we've given some force to the concept of R2P. We have turned it from a theoretical, by the way, it's why we intervened in Kosovo, we've turned it from a theoretical concept, and it now has some legal precedent. Whether that develops into anything, I don't know. It may not, but it may develop into precedent. But it still brings you back to where you can, you will, and where you can't, like in Syria, you can't. The Muslim Brotherhood is a really important issue. My guess is that we should not be... I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood is infiltrated end-to-end by Al-Qaeda. I think what you are seeing now developing is the Turkish model, exactly as you suggest. Proud Islamic states, but states and democracies. And by the way, is it really so illegitimate to have an Islamic state? We've got a Church of England one. Well, we do. It's an official state religion. Is there much difference? I think when we think about helping these countries in the Arab Spring, they are thinking Turkey is the model, and they're probably right. I'm not sure Britain's the model for them, and I'm certainly certain we shouldn't be pushing it down their throats. James, the people who will bring intervention out, I think, are the powerful, because it'll be in their interest to do so, because they want stability, because war is a threat to their ability to trade. It won't necessarily be done through the UN Security Council, and you're right to say the UN Security Council doesn't reflect the balance of world power. But my view is that increasingly the UN will not be a doer. Increasingly it will be the legitimizer in the future. I think the role of the UN in the future is not to do. It's not very good at doing. Take a look at Bosnia. Certainly in non-permissive circumstances. The role of the UN becomes the developer of international law, the structure within which international law is developed, and the legitimizer of actions. And my guess is that in future, when they turn around to legitimize action, they will subcontract it to organizations which are capable of doing it. And that does mean NATO in the first instance. That's why it was subcontracted to the alliance in Libya. That's what's happened in Afghanistan. And I think that's the model rather than the UN doing it. And by the way, I think that's right. The coalition of the willing is what ran me in Bosnia. The 52nd floor of the UN building on a 10,000-mile screwdriver was what ran my colleague in Kosovo. And I can tell you which of the two I preferred. It was far easier for me than for him. So I think if you follow that, then it is absolutely in our interest to begin to create those regional alliances who can take on this task. The African Union is a classic example. We should be giving force, ability, and capability to that organisation. Marta, what a success looks like. It looks pretty uncomfortable and pretty untidy for all the reasons I suggested to you. Success is what they make of it. But you have to have the strategic patience and the strategic tolerance. It took us 400 years to get over some of these issues. And so I think success looks messy. I think it looks very untidy. I think sometimes it will challenge us, and I think sometimes it'll bring us into conflict with those of our own domestic populations who gave their support for these operations. But unless you have that strategic patience, you can't bring it about. And Robert, on the globalization, here is my sort of last thoughts. I'm pushing you in too far here, I know. The key issue here, it seems to me, and this is where we came back to what Eustace saying, item number one from an intervention is security. If you cannot provide security, the population will move to somebody else who can. And usually those are the warlords or the criminal gangs. Look at it and see what happened in Iraq. If item number one is security, then item number one in a place like Bosnia, in a place like Libya, is to establish for the state the monopoly of the use of lethal force. And it's that crucial issue which we have to address. Nothing else will happen. You won't create the democracy or the economy until you have established security. And the key thing is so this issue of the armed gangs in Libya is the crucial issue which has to be addressed. And frankly, I think we should put all our resources, because that's the first step. Item number two is the rule of law. Frequently when we intervene, what we do is we do a deal with the powerful, because it makes it easier for us to intervene. And the powerful after a war are always the corrupt. It's exactly what happened in Bosnia. By the way, in Afghanistan too. And Iraq. Instead of going through the long, difficult process of building up the rule of law, we actually say easier to do a deal with Karzai's friends, easier to do a deal with Radovan Karadzic or with the other leaders in the war. Actually, the rule of law comes first. When I went to Bosnia, I said, we've got to make the rule of law number one priority. Unhappily, after 6 years, by that time, through the democratic process, the corrupt structures had got completely ingrained in the state. And I had to create the institutions, a state judiciary, a prosecutorial council, and we began to bring the corrupt structures, including the presidents, before the courts in Bosnia. You began to get corruption out of the system. Unless you get the mafia and corruption out of the system, you're actually not creating a democracy, you're creating a criminally captured state. So unless you deal with security and the rule of law first, you'll pay a price which is immeasurably greater in the future.
Paddy, thank you very much. I was going to make a joke about strategic patience, but I won't. So let's have 3 or 4 more questions. I've got 2 or 3 here from people who are watching this online. So perhaps we could move into maybe a little more Libya specific. Anybody got a Libya specific question? Gentlemen here.
Well, it links what Paddy was. My name's Richard Brown. I'm also vaguely associated with the PRDU, which Sean is with. It links to what Paddy was saying about security being essential in rule of law. I think also we need to add to that the continuance of adequate basic services, because what we saw in Iraq was when they broke down, the average person actually started rebelling against everybody who was trying to do something to help them. So if we don't keep the basic services going, that will affect what's happening as well. And really my question out of that is, because I don't know much about Libya, and perhaps Sean could help on this, is are the basic services being maintained or are they degrading? And is there a threat there, therefore, to the new order that's being established?
Good, thank you. Lady here, yeah.
I'm Valerie Seccarini from the organization Mercy Corps. My question concerns the role of the international community in Libya now. It would be interesting to see what is your point of view on who they are consulting with, because we keep on saying that it should be at the demand of the Libyan that we should bring support. But is there interaction only with the NTC? Are they talking also to civil society in Libya? Because that's a bit my fear. Who are they talking to, and to know what the needs are and what the Libyans really want? Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. I'm Nick Rosevear from MAG. We've been working in Libya since April, actually, 2011, starting off with just education for communities about the dangers of unexploded ordnance and terrible civilian casualties resulting from that. And we're moving now into the business of stockpile management and disarmament and destruction of stray weaponry, basically. My question is that, well, one of the difficulties we're having is moving between areas, although we're in 6 or 8 areas, but there are these kind of firewalls of authority that exist between different militia-controlled areas. Even though we have to have central permission to work in the country, it means nothing unless one has local permissions. If there is to be, I agree entirely with this point about the need to establish safe and secure environment for everything else to take root. But there is no power to exert penalties, as it were, for the use of lethal force not by the central control of the state. So there's no power at the moment to exert penalties for that. How does one create incentives for militias to see the value of surrendering their individual and fragmented use of lethal force?
Thank you. One more on Libya specific, gentleman here. This gentleman here, sir.
Thank you. Steve Huxley, Policy Advisor of the Methodist Church. Regarding oil revenues, what is the scope for oil revenues, the allocation and transparency around oil revenues to exacerbate competition and conflict within Libya? Does Libya have some good models from which we might learn, or do you think it's too early to say?
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got questions there on security, provision of services, interlocutors for the international community, mines and militias, and oil revenues. And Sean, I think, wanted to come in and talk to some of these points. Then we'll go to you two.
Yeah, let me address the question about the militias and the different firewalls. And I think that right now we have a government that's just been established in Tripoli, in Libya, and they have a remit, they have a mandate essentially up to the end of June, and I think they're going to be dealing with very, very short-term issues, shepherding the political transition process and trying to get to an election in June, and dealing with really the restoration of basic services and trying to get people back to work in the ministries and so on, trying to get money flowing around the country. And I think the issues around the militia are much more medium to long-term issues, and there are some short-term issues about how you organize, how you reward, how you acknowledge the role that these particularly young people have played in fighting to liberate Libya and so on. But a lot of it is about distrust, and one of the things that you hear as you move around Libya is the revolution isn't over. And this notion that the revolution isn't over is really until there is a legitimate elected central government, and until there is a new constitution, then I think these militias, the leaders, making sure that there's power sharing, that it's not all going to be completely and totally centralized as it was in the past in Tripoli, and until they can see this government in place, until there's been a negotiated power sharing agreement, shall we say, between the different military councils from Zintan, from Misrata, from Benghazi, from Tripoli, and so on. Until we arrive at that stage, I don't think. I think it's a long shot to expect that it will be possible to unify all of these militias into a national army. I think there's a very positive message in the fact that you haven't seen huge levels of retributive violence, that you haven't seen much clashes at a much greater levels, and a disaster in a sense. So I do think that it's possible, negotiating with local military councils, with local councils and military councils, it is possible usually to resolve issues and to move around. But I think really, again, it's part of our unrealistic expectations that before June, before an election, that we're going to see much progress in this area. I don't think it will happen.
Quite an interesting point actually occurs to me on the issue of militias, that the fate of Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, who you remember is wanted by the International Criminal Court, is still being held by the Zintani militia, which captured him precisely because he's a fantastic asset to have in this currently open-ended process of bargaining about who does what. Now, Sean and Paddy, I don't think you want to address some of these points.
Yeah, just I think both Sean and the gentleman from MAG raised an issue that I think is really points at a dilemma that we face in rebuilding societies after major conflict. I think Paddy's experience in Bosnia is going to be germane here as well, which is a chicken and egg problem. You have you have security and you have governance. You need to work on both at the same time. Of course, we are working on both at the same time, but there is a notion that you cannot really build a political structure and a governing structure in a lawless place. So you need to have security first taken care of. But the security in this case is taken care of by militias, which secure their own areas, but they're at loggerheads. And they don't recognize the governing structure because it has no legitimacy, but it won't have any legitimacy until you start building it. So there's the chicken and the egg. Where do you start? And I think, and at the heart of it is distrust. And again, I'm speaking from the Iraq experience as well, where until this very day, the biggest issue is distrust. And it comes from the legacy of a closed regime, very repressive. You don't know what is going on, a lot of secrecy. Nobody knows what everybody else was doing during the regime. Maybe they were doing openly one thing and secretly something else. For that, you need a sort of a transitional justice process, maybe that like you had in South Africa with some truth-telling, in addition to some amnesties, but also some prosecutions, a very careful, wise mix. But in Iraq, there was nothing of the sort. We only had de-Baathification, very vengeful. And in Libya, there is not even a discussion of it, except the UN, of course, has discussed it, but we don't see any of it. And the fact that Saif al-Islam is sitting in a prison in a room somewhere in detention without any sense of what is going to happen next, whether he's going to be appearing before a court, what kind of court, I think is telling. So that chicken and egg problem needs to be addressed through maybe small steps of trust building. And I think the issue of recognition you raised as well is very important, that these people need to there has to be public recognition that they have actually sacrificed themselves for the nation and played really a critical role. That has to be stated and acknowledged. Secondly, you need to have some kind of power sharing. Already we've seen that the head of the Zintan militia is now the Minister of Defense, and the head of the Misrata, or one of the leaders of the Misratan militia, is the Minister of Interior. That may not work, but the alternative is bound to fail. So it's somehow that is, they need to try it out and see how it works. But these are very important steps. On the issue of humanitarian work in Libya, the United Nations is there, the ICRC is there, the Red Cross, and there is also a number of non-governmental organizations from the Western world have gone there. I don't know if your organization, but in any case, MAG is there and others are already there. On the issue of oil revenues, where I cannot say anything of any sense, but transparency, there is none. But you have Revenue Watch, which is already in Libya and is addressing exactly these issues. How far they will get is an entirely different story, but at least there is already a focus. So NGOs are going to Libya. I have a sense that in the recent months or so, there is a tightening up of restrictions, and it's going to be harder to operate as the Libyans regain sort of a sense of sovereignty and sort of the desire to lay clear boundaries, set clear boundaries, and who comes into the country, what exactly are they doing. And it's a bit of a reversal to the old ways, but the old bureaucracy still being very much there, also being the new bureaucracy, and the same people and putting the same restrictions on getting a visa, for example, very basic stuff. So it's going to be a very hard battle, but there are organizations already there doing important work.
Let's have
the
last word.
I'm really grateful. I'm sorry that my time is short and I've gone on a bit, but there you go. I'm a politician. You can't give me a captive audience without me going on too long. Forgive me for that. So I'm going to keep it very short. Strategic patience, strategic tolerance for messy, untidy situations is the crucial thing here. And if you don't like it because it looks messy, get used to it, because that's probably the best you're going to be able to get. It didn't exactly look unmessy when we did it entirely ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it still doesn't. I want to come back to this business of of security. I just happen to believe that security is the number one thing on which you have to concentrate. Unless you have security followed by the rule of law, nothing else will follow. Now, because you know what to do doesn't make it easy to do. It is excruciatingly difficult, and I suspect you probably can't get circumstances more difficult than Libya when you have the various Syrian militias who won the war and therefore want a slice of the action in the peace. I mean, in Bosnia we solved the issue by putting 60,000 NATO troops in with so much overwhelming force, saying give up your guns or we'll shoot you. And that was easy, they gave up their guns. In Kosovo, we took the KLA and made it into a home guard and paid them. So we got them out of the militia business and into the business of having money in order to be able to work for the state. I don't know how you do it in Libya. It is excruciating, and it will be bloody difficult to do, and it will be messy, and you won't arrive at perfect solutions. But if somebody said to me, where does the international community put its money and its resources and its efforts, you put it only where the Libyans want you to put it. I'm sure you're right about that. But if we can put it into this area, as step one, we open the circumstances to be able to move beyond to steps 2, 3, and 4. And if that means giving these people jobs, giving them money, and getting them into the state through that means, bribery if you like, is one way, and that's maybe a bloody good use for international money going into Libya to help and enable precisely that. But I don't pretend, Ian, I've got an answer to this. I know what it is we were doing, but how the hell we get there, these guys are an expert on, not me. Thanks so much for asking me, Martin. I'm really grateful. See you later. Good luck.
Thank you.
You clap more than a Liberal Democrat conference.
Okay, so I've got 3 questions here from people outside. Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. We're going to return to them. We need to just take a few more just to get a few more listed. You were talking about delivery of security and services, I know. But let's just take another 2 or 3 questions and then we'll try to answer everything. So the lady here, please. Thank you.
Sorry, Lord Ashley explained us that during conflict, the international intervention are somehow changing a little bit because the world is changing. What I would like to hear is, do you think that in post-conflict it is changing? The intervention are changing. State building and peace building operation have increased and improved their way of working, but as it was explained by somebody from ODI, Rocha Menokal, in the last Third World Quarterly Journal, improvement have been done, but the result is not good enough. And it seems that those models look very much at democratic system or market economy, and are not looking enough into what are the needs of the people and the security of the people. And there is a need to change a little bit the way we intervene to rebuild in post-conflict. And I would like to know if you think we are going toward this evolution in Libya.
So let's have gentlemen here, please. And then we're going to have to really rush through.
Hi, Giulio Carini from Global Witness, and I've been in Libya now in September.
Very hard to hear you, I have to say.
Sorry, Giulio Carini from Global Witness. I was in Libya in September and also in December, helping civil society set up a roundtable on transparency issues there. And my question more is on emphasizing kind of the positive elements that Libya has going for it at the moment, and how that's going to affect, one, the fragmentation element you spoke of, and clearly in relation to that, the legitimacy of the NTC. And by positive, I mean the amount of money that the NTC has at disposal. It has, as was mentioned, oil revenues. It has a massive amount of oil revenues. Right now, it's about 1 million barrels, which pre-war was 1.7. So that's quite a positive element that it's gone back to close to what pre-war levels were, and supposedly by 2012, it will be back at pre-war levels, as well as massive amounts of money within the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So my question is, how do these positive elements within the structure of Libya affect how the NTC will hold its legitimacy, and how that will affect the fragmentation within tribes and within the military? Because I think that's quite an important issue. And then just to potentially answer the question about revenue transparency, if you want, I can talk a little bit about that.
Let's just take another question first, and maybe you can talk afterwards, because we're really running out of time. Lady here, and that's going to be the last question for now, please.
Alina Rocha Menocal from ODI. I like very much how you put it as a chicken and egg problem between security and governance. And I wanted to ask you if it's safe enough, conditions are safe enough in Libya to be holding the elections in June, or if there's a danger that this will descend in further violence and chaos, and if so, what the international community can do about that.
Thank you. I have a question here that I'm going to read out from somebody who is looking at the discussion online. It's from Nicholas Meller, who doesn't say where he comes from, but he asks an interesting question. How important is the digital infrastructure and pervasive access to the internet to facilitating consensus building in a multipolar world and the stabilization process in Libya? So if we take that, we've got 4 questions, and the gentleman over here who still wants an answer to his earlier question on the provision of services and security. So let's look at those and see if we've got any time left. Sean.
Yeah, just very quickly, I did want to respond to a couple of questions here, because first and foremost on Mercy Corps, I think Mercy Corps is doing wonderful work in Libya at the moment, and the fact that the culture in Libya has not been one which is conducive to civil society. There isn't a culture of civil society organizations. There were very few, almost non-existent charities and so on. But what we've seen up to the end of November, authorities in Benghazi and Tripoli had registered around 900 NGOs. And I think this brings us really to the crux of the question about political transitions and about options for Libya's future. You look at the work that Mercy Corps is doing, establishing capacity development centers for NGOs, so that people who have no experience of organizing NGOs get the skills and the abilities and the knowledge to be able to organize, so that you can bring together people around the issues. And the critical question here is civic awareness, civic education, civic engagement. How do you translate the wishes and expectations and concerns and priorities that ordinary Libyan people have into the political process? And I think this is the kind of work that Mercy Corps is doing, and there are a number of other NGOs that are doing it there. But it begs the question, I'm really sorry that Paddy Ashton had to leave, because it comes back to what Eust was saying. The international community needs to respect the will of the Libyan people and the sovereignty of Libya and so on. But the questions that we heard when we were there on the ground are is it respect for the will of the people? What do you know about the will of the people? And if we're being rushed into an election without sufficient knowledge or experience of electoral processes or electoral issues or electoral systems, if we're being rushed into a constitution that decides the type of state and the system of government and the allocation of resources and the division of the country and so on, the rights of different groups and minorities and so on, and we're being rushed into drafting that constitution that will be done in 60 days when we still don't even know what is a constitution or what's a constitution building process. And I think it begs the question, nobody asked, why are there no political parties in the electoral law? It begs the question, if you don't have political parties and you can't aggregate people's political, social, economic interests and represent those interests in a parliament, how are you going to have an effective democracy? How are you going to channel people's concerns and people's expectations into a constitution-making process? And I think that's an important question that we do need to think about. And again, as I said, I'm sorry that Paddy's gone, because, why are we at a stage, or why do the Libyan leadership feel that there has to be an election in June? What is it about liberal peace and the model that we seem to, the paradigm that we seem to adhere to at the moment, that means that legitimacy only comes through an election? Because I think it will come back to haunt Libya, and we may be sowing the seeds of a future conflict. Well, we don't make these decisions. It is for the Libyan people to make them. But what is it about the current paradigm that makes the NTC feel that they have to have an election in June? I think that's a very important question. Shall I just respond to the question about services? And I think during the conflict you had insecurity, and a lot of people simply didn't go to work. In Tripoli, bombardments and so on, in different parts of the country there was insecurity. You had a lot of the both professional and the labour classes that come from outside of Libya, and they left the country. And then you have a situation where ministries stopped functioning because people didn't go to work, because you have a very centralised model in the ministries in Libya, and you have whole questions of the capacities and the systems and the processes to make things run. And then there's the banking issue and the flow of finance and funds and unfreezing assets and so on. So I think, when I was there, certainly people were very concerned that, about sanitation, garbage collection, education, hospitals, and so on and so forth. And I think there is a lot of work, and it needs to be done quickly, because otherwise people become very disillusioned.
Just can you pick up some of the
themes,
unanswered questions and loose ends would be great.
Yeah, well, I can't answer the question from the online requester on the digital infrastructure, I'm afraid. But I'm not a Libya expert, but so I cannot address issues of exactly what is the progress made on the ground on X, Y, or Z. But I think the question of sort of the NTC's access to funds and what that's going to mean for its own capability to govern and its legitimacy is very important. I would just like to say, drawing on the Iraq experience that I have, and again making very clear that what happened in Iraq won't necessarily happen in Libya. It's a very different situation. But things to look out for, I think, in Iraq, there was, for example, a real hunger among ordinary people or the elites, let's say, in the institutions, coming out into civil society for expertise and for exposure to the ways of our ways. And there was a lot of, because the US was there and it was very easy for NGOs to go in and to work with Iraqis. And there was a lot of training and capacity building and this and that. Capacity is not built overnight. And in a situation where a population has been under dictatorial control for a very long time, for decades, which has instilled in people it's a command structure, and people follow instructions or else. And there is essentially no free will on issues of politics. It is very, very difficult to build capacity anytime fast. It's generational, basically. And so I would fully support Paddy Ashdown when he says have strategic patience and don't expect anything soon as you help people in Libya to help them develop the ability to state what it is they want as a people and as a sovereign nation through political participation in government. And this may be subverted, as it has been in Iraq, by a state which now is blocking our access to the very people who are seeking it. So what is the will of the people? Well, there's the will of the people, there's the will of a government. It's not necessarily the same. And the government has the capability to block access. And so it's a race, essentially, against time to help those who seek it with the things that they need and want, against those who are trying to reimpose the old restrictions because they fear the popular will, essentially, and are trying to recreate old authoritarian structures because that's also what they're most familiar with, and that is what could easily develop if the people, as such, don't win out. The other issue on the funds, especially, is, Libya is, and this is a cliche almost, is potentially a rich country because of the oil. Well, we said the same of Iraq. In fact, it is potentially extremely rich because it has greater potential oil and gas reserves than most other countries, maybe except for Saudi Arabia. And but where is that money? Well, it is not going to positive objects, let's say. A lot of it is disappearing. Iraq is at the bottom of the list for Transparency International, almost at the very bottom. And the risk in a place like Libya also, where you don't have a well-constituted, legitimate government with transparent structures of governance, that all this money, which is coming in, is also not going to be spent the way it ought to be. And so it's a critical challenge that Libya is facing. And again, I don't want to predict anything or to say this is what's happening now and the money is disappearing. I don't know that, but this is something to watch out for.
Joost, thank you very much. Apologies to those who feel that their questions were unanswered, including 2 here online, although one of them was to Paddy Ashton about Syria, so we can sort of claim to have looked at that a little bit. Very useful discussion. Thank you to the speakers and to Paddy who's gone. Thank you to all of you for your contributions. If anybody wants to loiter at the end, I guess that we could probably thrash out a couple more questions, but thank you for coming. Bye-bye.